Why are you here? There must be a reason for you to be here.
Yes, I'm here to fight for truth and justice in the American way.
James Gunn's 2025 Superman gave us a new, fresh, and much-needed take on the well-known superhero. He is warm, kind, and always tries his best to help every single being. But is David Cornsweet's portrayal a good representation of who Superman is and has always been? How loyal is this adaptation of the classic hero? The first Superman comic came out almost 90 years ago, in 1938. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster created a hero who was all about protecting the oppressed. Back then, Superman was a symbol of hope during the Great Depression and the rise of fascism in Europe. Interestingly, he was also a socialist. In his first couple of appearances, he'd fight the rich and the corrupt, standing up for the working class. But by the time the 40s came around, Clark Kent's characterization had changed. Suddenly, he was a soldier, a wartime hero, and a patriot. Given that this was in the middle of the Second World War, this shift wasn't exactly surprising. Superman's characterization had always reflected the times. This is especially evident when looking at the evolution of the character in movies and TV. From one film to the next, Superman can go from being goofy to serious, broody to sociable, and confident to awkward. Does this mean that there is no consistency to Superman? Well, no. The core of Superman has mostly remained intact over the years. But what is this core? And what does it look like when filtered through the lens of different eras, directors, and cultural moments? To answer that, let's take a look at the evolution of Superman in movies and examine how each cinematic version has shaped, challenged, or reinforced our understanding of the Man of Steel.
Up in the sky, look! It's a bird! It's a plane! It's Superman!
Superman's first on-screen appearance happened just 3 years after his comic debut. Between 1941 and 1943, the character appeared in 17 animated shorts produced by Fleischer Studios and later Famous Studios. But the first live-action portrayal of the iconic character only came in 1948. Kirk Alyn was cast as the titular role in 1948's Superman, directed by Spencer Gordon Bennett and Thomas Carr. The project was a 15-part serial that was followed by another serial of the same length 2 years later, 1950's Adam vs. Superman. The second installment was especially exciting, as fans finally got to see Superman fight his arch-nemesis Lex Luthor, played by Lyle Talbot, on screen. Kirk Alyn's Superman was playful and mischievous, and looking back, he was a solid choice for the first on-screen portrayal of Superman. However, Alyn didn't get to enjoy being the only live-action Superman for long. In 1951, George Reeves stepped into the role and played the beloved superhero in Superman and the Mole Man. The film was directed by Lee Sholem. It was shot on an extremely tight budget, largely due to the fact that it was always meant to be more of a pilot for a future TV show. In 1952, said show started airing. Adventures of Superman became the first Superman TV show in history. It ran from 1952 to 1958, releasing 6 seasons and 104 episodes in that time. George Reeves' Superman was an interesting character that had very much reflected the time. He was warm, friendly, and confident, but he could also be stern and authoritative. Even his Clark Kent was much sharper and more no-nonsense than we'd see in later adaptations. Reeves' Superman was like a beloved father figure, someone who you could trust and rely on, who always had plenty of wisdom to share, and who was both kind and fierce. Reeves got to be the face of live-action Superman for 7 long years, but he sadly passed away just a year after the show ended in 1959. It would be 20 years before the next big Superman project hit our screens, but when it did, it changed the superhero film genre forever. Ask any longtime Superman fan who the ultimate on-screen Superman is, and they'll all likely mention one name: Christopher Reeve. In 1978, Reeve got to play the character in Richard Donner's Superman. The film became the first ever superhero blockbuster, and to this day, it's considered the blueprint for superhero movies. Superman had everything: incredible music, innovative visuals, and an actor who knew how to make people fall in love with both Superman and Clark Kent. Reeves' Superman had strong moral values, but he was also gentler and more vulnerable than his predecessors. He came across as more human and relatable. But Superman was only half of what made Reeves' performance so groundbreaking. The spin he put on the Clark Kent persona really made you believe that people wouldn't immediately connect Clark to Superman. Where Superman was confident and steadfast, Clark was clumsy and awkward. This duality was one of the reasons the movie was so successful. It brought a certain amount of realism to the character without going too dark or losing its charm and humor. However, as much as the first movie was a huge hit, the behind-the-scenes politics would eventually destroy the franchise for years and years. Not before giving us 3 more sequels of varying quality though. The Superman movies were produced by Alexander and Ilya Salkind, who first bought the rights to the character in 1973. They spent some time trying to find the right director for the project, with Steven Spielberg himself being one of the candidates. Eventually, they decided to hire Richard Donner. Then, Christopher Reeve was cast as Superman, and Margot Kidder secured the role of Lois Lane. The film had a budget of $55 million, making it the most expensive movie of the time. But with how successful it was, there was no question. A sequel had to be made. Superman 2 first came out in 1980, though it was only released in the US a year later in 1981. Luckily, the film did well at the box office. It was the 3rd highest grossing movie of the year after Raiders of the Lost Ark and On Golden Pond. However, the film was a bit of a nightmare to make. Officially, it was directed by both Richard Donner and Richard Lester. This is because Donner left mid-production, due to his disagreements with the Salkinds. Lester then had to finish the job, and he put his own spin on it. Superman 2 ended up being a lot more playful and lighthearted than the first film. It wasn't what Donner had envisioned, but in general, audiences still liked it. However, not everyone was ready to let the original version go. For years, fans kept demanding to know more about Donner's vision for the sequel, and so finally, in 2006, the Donner Cut came out. Superman 2, the Richard Donner Cut, featured about 80% of new footage and was much more sincere and serious in nature. Donner's version of the film received positive reviews from critics, fans, and even the actors themselves. This wouldn't be the last time a different director's cut would be released of a film featuring Superman, but we'll get into that later. After the success of Superman 2, 2 more sequels came out. Superman 3 hit theaters in 1983 and was, yet again, directed by Lester. 4 years later, in 1987, Sidney J. Fury's Superman 4, The Quest for Peace came out. Neither of these films did particularly well with the fans. The serious tone was gone, replaced by a more campy approach. Superman 3 still did relatively well, but The Quest for Peace was a huge miss. On top of tonal issues, special effects were also terrible, due to budget constraints. The studio received so much criticism for the last 2 installments that they decided to end the franchise right then and there. It would be 19 years before we'd get another major Superman movie. But that doesn't mean that the character of Superman disappeared from our screens completely. From the late 80s to the early 2000s, Superman adaptations would mostly stick to the small screen. In this era, we got to see several Superman TV shows, many of which were more experimental. This was the time when screenwriters, directors, and producers weren't afraid to take the characters somewhere new and interesting. Everyone knew there was no replacing Reeves' Superman, so the question was, what else could be done with the Man of Steel? In 1988, Superboy started airing. The show was produced by the Salkinds, the same people who did the Reeve movies. It gave us a glimpse into Clark Kent's early days as Superboy, with many beloved characters including Lana Lang, Lex Luthor, and Jor-El making an appearance. Superboy was on air for 4 seasons, from 1988 to 1992. The titular character was portrayed by John Hames Newton in Season 1, but was later replaced by Jared Christopher, who played Clark from Season 2 onwards. But Superboy wasn't the only show that gave us a different take on Superman. In 1993, Lois and Clark: The New Adventures of Superman came out. Dean Cain got to play Clark, while Terry Hatcher was cast as Lois. This show almost gave us the complete opposite of Superboy. Gone was the young Clark Kent who was still finding himself. Lois and Clark offered a glimpse into what Superman would be like as a married man. This and Lois's romance and relationship was a huge part of the show, getting as much space and focus as Clark's Superman antics. In 1996, we were also treated to Superman the Animated Series. The show was part of the DC animated universe and came after the success of Batman the Animated Series. To this day, this show is beloved by many fans of Superman. It's very much a love letter to the history and evolution of the character. It combines elements of the more classic version of Superman while still modernizing the material. Interestingly, the animated series Superman was also much more human and vulnerable than many of his predecessors. Usually, Superman was portrayed as this unbeatable, ultra-powerful being, but in the animated show, he'd often be shown struggling and even getting beaten up. While some fans considered this to be a controversial choice on the creator's part, others still love the series and consider it to be one of the best installments in the Superman screen adaptations universe. But there is one more show we can't forget about. In 2001, Tom Welling took on the iconic role in WB's Smallville. Yet again, we got to see a younger Clark Kent who was yet to become the Superman. He only got to don the famous suit at the end of the show. At first, the creators weren't sure if the show would work. Writer-producer Alfred Goff admitted that it felt frivolous at first. However, he was quickly proven wrong due to a horrific tragedy that changed the world forever.
There is a major incident in Lower Manhattan.
Another passenger plane hitting the World Trade Center.
Smallville provided the perfect kind of escapism after the 9/11 attacks. America needed a hero, and Tom Welling's Clark Kent was the perfect guy for the job. He was a young man from small-town America who was ready to fight for justice. This, combined with the success of previous teen hero shows, such as Buffy the Vampire Slayer, made Smallville into one of the most successful superhero shows of all time. It ran for 10 seasons and received several awards along the way, including Emmy and Teen Choice Awards. But after so many years of being tied to the small screen, it was time for Superman to make his big return. In 2006, Bryan Singer's Superman Returns hit the cinemas. Brandon Routh got to portray the classic superhero, and many loved how close he seemed to the Christopher Reeve version. Superman Returns picked up right where Superman 2 left off. The movie ignored the existence of Superman 3 and the quest for peace, focusing instead on continuing with Donner's legacy and vision. Singer was a huge fan of the 1978 movie, and it showed in his contribution to the Superman film adaptations. The movie was an overall success. It received positive reviews and became the 9th highest grossing film of the year. Both Singer and Routh were excited to make a sequel, but unfortunately, this never happened. Warner Brothers felt that while the movie was successful, it could have done better. They didn't have enough faith in the franchise, and so after some back and forth, they decided to shift their focus to the Dark Knight movies instead, forgetting all about Routh's Superman. Warner Brothers would eventually come back with another live-action Superman. But before that, we got one of the best on-screen adaptations of the character in history. In 2012, the animated film Superman vs. the Elite came out, and it quickly became many people's favorite Superman movie of all time. The film featured DC Animated Universe's George Newbern and David Kaufman, who reprised their respective roles as Superman and Jimmy Olsen. To this day, many think of it as one of the best comic book adaptations out there, with only the somewhat outdated art style holding it back from truly reaching mainstream success. In 2012, the CW released the first season of their new superhero show, Arrow. The show did really well, and soon spin-offs started popping up left, right, and center, creating the Arrowverse. In 2014, we got The Flash, and in 2015, Supergirl came out. It was Supergirl that eventually introduced us to another iteration of Superman, played by Tyler Hoechlin. He first appeared in the show's second season in 2016, and the character quickly proved to be popular. He'd guest star in many of the other Arrowverse shows, including Arrow, The Flash, Batwoman, and Legends of Tomorrow. In 2021, Hoechlin's Superman even got his own show, Superman and Lois, though this one does take place on a different Earth than the rest of the Arrowverse. While Hoechlin's Superman was never the main hero of the Arrowverse, the character was well received. His Clark in particular was well beloved, with Hoechlin bringing real warmth to him, making him endearing to watch, especially compared to the next big version of Superman we have to discuss. For better or for worse, Zack Snyder and Henry Cavill have been synonymous with the modern image of Superman for the last decade or so. After Bryan Singer's vision for a new Superman franchise was abandoned, Warner Brothers decided to look elsewhere. They put all their eggs in Christopher Nolan's basket, and he gave us one of the best interpretations of Batman in the history of cinema. However, when it came to making a Superman movie, Nolan wasn't fully on board. He was simply too busy to direct a project like that. But when screenwriter David S. Goyer pitched him a darker Superman film, he did agree to help him develop the story. After that, things were set in motion. Zack Snyder was brought on as the director, and Henry Cavill secured the role of the titular character. Man of Steel came out in 2013, and it did relatively well at the box office. It was the 9th highest grossing film of the year, with the number 1 spot going to Disney's Frozen. Man of Steel had tough competition too. At this time, the MCU was in full swing. Iron Man 3 and Thor: The Dark World both came out in that same year, with the former becoming the second highest grossing film of the year. The fact that Man of Steel could hold its own seemed like a good sign, at least on the surface. But despite the financial success of Man of Steel, the movie wasn't exactly beloved by all Superman fans. Henry Cavill's take on Superman largely deviated from the established canon. He was darker, more existential, and some even described him as borderline uncaring. Even though the Superman character had changed a lot throughout the years, at his core, he was still that warm, optimistic guy ready to fight for justice. With Snyder's interpretation, it just felt like something was missing. Why did this happen? Well, it all goes back to Nolan's Batman. Because the more gritty, realistic Dark Knight movies did so well, Warner Brothers seemed to think that this was the right way to approach all their superhero movies. But what worked for Batman wouldn't exactly work for Superman, with the two being fundamentally different heroes. Man of Steel Superman had plenty of issues, but things would only get worse with his upcoming film appearances. Trying to catch up with Marvel, DC decided to build their own cinematic universe. The DC Extended Universe, aka the DCEU, was born, and people were not impressed. In 2016, Batman vs Superman: Dawn of Justice came out, and it received mixed to negative reviews. While some appreciated how ambitious and unique the project was, most agreed that it had glaring flaws that took away from it. The film has been described as too dark and brooding, with a confusing and overbloated plot and mischaracterization of its protagonists. Superman also didn't get nearly enough screen time in the film, despite the fact that he was a titular character and the DCEU's only established character at the time. What's worse, Superman literally died at the end of the film, only for people not to care all that much. Most fans had not warmed up to Cavill's Superman enough by that point. So what was supposed to be a huge, heartbreaking moment mostly fell flat. Superman would later be brought back for the following DCEU films, including Joss Whedon's Justice League, as well as Zack Snyder's cut of Justice League. He also appeared at the end of Black Adam, and at the time, it was announced that Henry Cavill would be making a full-blown return to the franchise. Fans of the Snyderverse were excited for a potential Man of Steel sequel. However, the excitement some people felt was soon squashed. Warner Brothers brought in James Gunn to reboot the failure that was the DCEU, and Gunn made the decision not to bring most of the established characters and actors back. This included Cavill's Superman, which brought an end to this darker Superman era. After the overall failure of Henry Cavill's Superman, fans of the superhero were ready for a change, and this was just what we got in 2023, with My Adventures with Superman. This animated series felt like a breath of fresh air. Jack Quaid lent his voice to Superman, and his version of the character felt much like a return to form. This shows Superman is simply an all-powerful hero who always wants to do the right thing. There is no darkness to him, no unnecessary edge. He is exactly the kind of hero the world needs right now. And James Gunn's recent movie seems to agree. Superman only came out very recently, but it's already proving to be a huge hit. David Cornsweet's Superman had been a box office success, and people are loving what he and James Gunn brought to the table. The 2025 version of Superman is kind to a fault. He cares about every single life, and he's not willing to let a city be destroyed just so he can defeat the bad guy. His priority is always serving and protecting humanity, and that's what makes him so lovable. Cornsweet's Clark is also very well done, with the character being able to showcase his more nerdy side, as well as some of his flaws that only make him that much more human. Ultimately, this new version of Superman gets it right. At his core, Superman is all about doing your best to help those around you. The interpretations of Superman that didn't lean enough into this aspect of the character were less successful for a reason. The character isn't meant to be dark and broody. We have Batman for that. People turn to Superman for warmth, safety, and optimism. A world with a Superman should always be a world that everyone feels safe in. The new Superman movie does this well. After I watched it, I walked out of the cinema with a big smile on my face. Could this be the start of a genuinely successful DCU? Only time will tell. But right now, I'm hopeful. And that's exactly how Superman is supposed to make you feel.